right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're jumping into something that I think really gets right at the heart of how we all process information and, well, communicate effectively.
Mhm.
You've shared some fascinating source material with us, all related to Matthew Allen's book, Smart Thinking, Skills for Critical Understanding and Writing. We're focusing particularly on the preface and those, foundational early chapters.
That's right. And based on these sections, Allen's Smart Thinking isn't like just another dense logic textbook. It's really set up as a practical guide. It takes those useful ideas from informal logic, how arguments actually function out in the real world, but combines them with this core insight. Reasoning isn't just some abstract thing happening in your head. Fundamentally, it's a communicative act. It's always tied to a social context.
Exactly. And that's our mission for this deep dive, right? To pull out the most important, the most useful nuggets from these early parts of the book. We want to give you a solid head start on understanding what this smart thinking idea is all about and how you can actually start approaching it in a way that works for you. I found some bits really eye-opening, I have to say, particularly the idea that, well, smart thinking isn't innate, it's a skill you build, and also how crucial just asking the right questions is, maybe even more than finding answers immediately. So yeah, let's dig in.
Okay, so Allen starts off by defining what he actually means by smart thinking. Basically, it's knowing how to figure out and express your main ideas clearly. It involves planning how you'll communicate them, checking you've covered the necessary points, structuring your thoughts logically, and then presenting those ideas by linking them together effectively, whether you're trying to persuade someone or just explain something. At its core, it's deeply connected to how you find information, how you analyze it, and critically, how you communicate that knowledge.
Right. So it's not just about passively absorbing information. It's about actively working with it. And it starts way before you even write or speak, doesn't it? It's about really understanding the information you've got, figuring out which bits are actually relevant for what you're trying to achieve, knowing when you actually need more information. And this seems key, understanding the context, who are you talking to? What's the specific situation? And even what are your own potential biases or assumptions getting in the way?
He absolutely positions reasoning as the bedrock of smart thinking. And he makes this really important distinction. It's not just about having reasons for believing something. It's the active process of exploring and understanding the relationships between things out there in the world. Could be events, objects, ideas, whatever. The sources really emphasize that individual things don't just have meaning on their own. Their significance comes from how they connect to everything else. Reasoning is how we grasp those connections and then talk about them.
Yeah, he uses that really simple analogy, the apple and the orange one. Just looking at them, okay, they're two different things, but reasoning lets you say, oh, okay, they're both fruit. You found a similarity. Or this apple is red, that orange is, well, orange, noting a difference. Or you might connect them to your own experience. Eating oranges reminds me of being a kid. Without that ability to make connections, every single experience, every object, it would just feel totally new and isolated, wouldn't it? Confusing. You couldn't build knowledge or predict anything.
And here's that really crucial point you mentioned earlier straight from the book. Reasoning does not come naturally. It's not like breathing. It's a skill, something you absolutely have to learn and consciously practice to get better at. It relies on understanding and using specific patterns of connection. Things like, spotting similarities and differences, seeing common threads or inconsistencies, figuring out if one thing is necessary for another or if it's sufficient. These patterns are the tools.
That makes so much sense when you put it like that. And we use this learned skill constantly, don't we? Arguing a point with someone, explaining why the car broke down, trying to make a big decision, predicting if it'll rain, exploring some complex issue in the news, or just trying to justify why we did something. It all seems to boil down to using and communicating knowledge effectively.
Now, here's where Allen adds that really distinctive angle. He really insists that reasoning isn't just some, abstract logic puzzle. It is always a social act. Always. People use reasoning for real-world purposes, economic goals, political arguments, just navigating social situations. And how they see those connections, their perspective, is inevitably shaped by who they are, their age, their class, their gender, ethnicity, culture, personal history. All of it plays a role. If you forget that social dimension, if you try to treat reasoning like it happens in a vacuum, your thinking just won't be as effective. Those connections you make, they only really become meaningful when you consider who is communicating them to whom, when, where, and crucially, why.
That's such a powerful point, actually. It reframes the whole thing. It means studying smart thinking isn't about becoming some kind of cold, detached logic bot, right? It's more about becoming really aware of the analytical processes you're already using, including how those processes are shaped by you and the world around you, so you can then refine them, use them more deliberately.
Exactly. And the book also brings up this idea of thinkers with attitude.
Yeah.
It's not just about skills. Smart thinking requires a certain mindset. It's not enough just to collect facts. You also need to understand the frameworks, the mental models we all use to make sense of those facts. Smart thinkers, Alan suggests, are constantly, almost habitually, checking their own frameworks. They question their underlying assumptions. They ask themselves things like, hang on, are my views actually consistent here? Or what am I just taking for granted? Why do I tend to see this issue this particular way?
Right. And building directly on that attitude of questioning, the book makes this really compelling case. The most vital analytical skill isn't actually finding the answer right away, it's asking the right question. The sources really hammer this home, that developing complex knowledge and communicating it well, it's fundamentally driven by knowing what to ask. It's that willingness not to just accept things at face value that really fuels deeper understanding.
So why bother developing this skill? Why is it needed? The book lays out several pretty convincing reasons. First, smart thinking just helps you understand the world more deeply. It makes you better at solving problems effectively. It's obviously crucial for success in study and work. Think about making good decisions, tackling complex projects, communicating clearly with colleagues or clients, and maybe most importantly, it helps you be an active, informed member of your community. It equips you to navigate those complex social dynamics we talked about, and maybe even identify and challenge things like bias or injustice when you see them.
He even drops in that bad religion lyric, doesn't he? There is an inner logic, and we're taught to stay far from it. It's used to illustrate this warning the book gives against falling into one of two traps. On one side, you've got just blindly accepting authority or believing in some purely objective truth that can't be questioned. But on the other side, there's this trap of extreme relativism where it's like, oh, well, every opinion is equally valid no matter how flimsy the reasoning behind it. Smart thinking, Alan argues, helps you find that inner logic. It helps you see that knowledge is often tangled up with contexts of power and influence. It's rarely, if ever, just purely objective data floating free.
And perhaps the most interesting twist there, connecting back to reasoning as a social act. The book highlights that even when you reason and communicate your ideas, that act itself can be a form of exercising power and influence, something to be mindful of.
That is definitely something to chew on. Okay, so we've sketched out the big picture, what smart thinking is, why Alan thinks we need it, that crucial social context. Now, let's zoom in a bit. Let's talk about the fundamental building blocks. The book apparently breaks down language into 4 levels: word, statement, text, context. But for reasoning, the core unit of analysis, according to Alan, is the claim.
Exactly. Claims are presented as a specific kind of statement. They're the atoms of arguments, if you like.
So what makes a regular statement into a claim in this system? The key thing, the defining feature, is that it asserts something about the world. And crucially, it's possible to ask whether that assertion is true or false. The book gives that simple example: the world is round. That's a claim. You can investigate it, evaluate it. But if you just ask, is the world round or flat? That's a question, not a claim itself.
Right. And these claims are the basic units we need to identify when we're trying to understand an argument or an explanation somebody's giving. The tricky part, as the book points out, is that in normal everyday language, flowing sentences, paragraphs, stories, these individual claims can sometimes get a bit buried or obscured. Alan even notes that sometimes a rhetorical question can actually function as a claim because the intended assertion is clear, even though it's phrased as a question. Like, isn't it obvious we need to act? Is really asserting it is obvious we need to act.
The sources highlight some really vital properties of these claims. First off, these things called internal connections. Every claim basically links at least 2 ideas together, typically a subject and a predicate. Like in reasoning, subject is a skill predicate. That internal link within the claim is what then allows us to link different claims to each other when we build up an argument or explanation.
Ellen also points out that claims can sometimes sort of contain other claims within them. This happens, for instance, when you're reporting what someone else said. You say, George W. Bush said that. Whatever follows is an embedded claim within your main claim about what Bush said. It also happens in those if-and statements you see in logic. And if X happens, then Y will follow. The real assertion, the main claim, is about the relationship between X and Y.
Okay, and here's something that feels really practical for actually evaluating arguments you encounter. The book really emphasizes scope and certainty as critical properties of claims. Scope is about how widely the claim applies. Is it about all things, some things, a few things? Or is it about a specific area or time period? And certainty is about, well, how sure the claim is. Is it definite, it will rain, probable, it's likely to rain, or just possible, there's a chance of rain? Paying attention to the scope and certainty being used or implied helps you avoid making or spot others making errors, like the classic sweeping generalization, right? Claiming something is true for all based on evidence about some.
Absolutely. And another critical distinction that sources make is between descriptive claims and value claims. Descriptive claims are about how things are, or were, or will be. Facts, observations, predictions, the unemployment rate went down. Value claims, on the other hand, involve judgment. They're about how things should be or shouldn't be. Good or bad, right or wrong. We ought to invest more in education. The book warns us to be alert because many claims that look purely descriptive on the surface might actually have hidden value judgments smuggled in through word choice, like calling a policy unfair versus less efficient. And context is everything. A descriptive claim like ice caps are melting can easily become support for a value conclusion. Therefore, we should take action when linked with other claims. Being sharp about spotting these values, stated or unstated, is a key smart thinking habit.
Oh, okay, so we have these claims, these building blocks. How do they actually work together when we reason? What roles do they play?
Allen explains their function primarily in terms of premises and conclusions. This is fundamental. Any claim, literally any claim, can serve either role. It just depends entirely on how it's being used in relation to other claims in a specific argument or explanation. Premises are the claims you offer up as the reasons, the evidence, the justification for accepting another claim. And that other claim, the one being supported, is the conclusion.
Right, the book uses that fantastic, simple example. Your car is dirty. That statement, that claim. It can be a premise if you say, since your car is dirty premise, you should watch it conclusion. Here, the dirtiness is the reason for the action. But the exact same claim, your car is dirty, becomes the conclusion if you say your car is dirty conclusion because you drove through that massive mud puddle premise. Now, the dirtiness is what you're concluding, and the mud puddle is the reason why. Its function completely flips based on the linking word and the structure.
Exactly. It's all about the relationship. And the book mentions that conclusions themselves can serve different purposes. They might be predicting something, it will probably rain tomorrow, establishing what is or was the case, the experiment confirmed the hypothesis, calling for action, you should vote, or explaining why something happened, the bridge collapsed due to metal fatigue.
Okay, so reasoning is all about linking these claims premises leading to conclusions. The book notes that in normal language, like writing or conversation, we often find little clues about these links, signal words like therefore, because, so, since, or sometimes just the way ideas are ordered. But often the underlying logical structure isn't super explicit, right? You kind of have to infer the connections yourself.
That's precisely the issue Allen raises. He argues that while that kind of narrative flow is great for making communication smooth and engaging, it can actually make the underlying logic, the bones of the argument, harder to see clearly. Sometimes deliberately so, sometimes accidentally. And this is where he introduces that really practical tool he advocates, the analytical structure format.
Right, and the point isn't necessarily that you should write all your emails or essays in this format. It's more of a behind-the-scenes tool for you, isn't it? For clarifying and really getting control of your own thinking process before you try to express it.
Absolutely spot on. It's primarily a tool for understanding and planning. It involves two main steps. First, you meticulously list out every distinct claim involved in the reasoning, and you number them. Just get them all down on paper. Second, you draw a diagram that visually maps how these numbered claims relate to each other. Use standard symbols, typically an arrow pointing from a premise or premises up to the conclusion it supports. And if multiple premises have to work together as a single reason, you link those premises with a plus sign before drawing the arrow to the conclusion. Conventionally, the main overall conclusion sits at the very bottom of the diagram, showing how everything else ultimately feeds into it. By forcing you to separate the claims and visually map the links, it strips away the narrative fluff and makes the logical structure totally explicit. You can see exactly what's supposed to be supporting what.
And the book talks about simple versus complex structures, right? Simple is just one layer, a few premises directly supporting the main conclusion. But complex structures have multiple layers. A claim might first act as a conclusion based on some lower-level premises, and then that same claim turns around and acts as a premise to support an even higher-level conclusion, like a sub-argument within the main argument.
Exactly. And digging into how those premises link up, Allen discusses dependent versus independent premises. This is a really useful distinction when you're evaluating how strong an argument is. Independent premises are basically separate reasons for the conclusion. Each one, theoretically, offers some support on its own. If you remove one, the others might still stand. Dependent premises, however, are different. They only work together. They form a single combined reason. You need all the claims in that dependent set for the reason to function at all. If one part is weak or false, the whole reason collapses.
Okay, let me see if I get that. If I argue you should take the train conclusion because it's faster premise 1 and it's cheaper premise 2, those might be independent. Faster is one reason, cheaper is another. Either might be enough on its own for some people. But if I argue Socrates is mortal conclusion because all men are mortal premise 1 and Socrates is a man premise 2, those premises, all men are mortal and Socrates is a man, are dependent, right? You absolutely need both of them together to logically reach the conclusion that Socrates is mortal. One on its own doesn't get you there.
Precisely. That's a perfect example. And the book makes an interesting observation about independent premises. Often, for them to seem convincing, they rely quite heavily on unstated assumptions or connections that the audience is just expected to fill in mentally. Dependent chains, even though they might look a bit more complex when you diagram them, actually tend to make the reasoning more explicit because they force you to articulate those necessary connecting thoughts as actual premises within the argument. Less is left implied.
That's really useful. And apparently within those dependent links, some premises can play special roles. They're not all just generic bits of evidence.
Yes, the book highlights a couple of special functions. One is the idea of framing premises. These often act like general rules, principles, or warrants. They essentially explain how the other, more specific premises in the dependent set actually connect to and support the conclusion. So in your Socrates example, all men are mortal acts as a framing premise. It provides the general rule that links the specific fact Socrates is a man to the conclusion Socrates is mortal. He also mentions defining premises. These are pretty straightforward. Their job is simply to clarify the meaning of a key term being used in the argument, just to make sure everyone's on the same page and avoid misunderstandings down the line.
Okay, this is great. We've got claims, premises, conclusions, linking instructions. So finally, how does the book suggest you ensure that the link itself, the logical step from your premises to your conclusion, is actually a good one? How do you make the reasoning solid?
It essentially circles back to those properties of claims we discussed earlier and how you use them. First, pay attention to the internal connections within your claims, the subjects and predicates, and use those connections to guide how you structure the links between claims. Critically, ensure the scope and certainty expressed in your premises logically warrant the scope and certainty you're claiming in your conclusion. Don't make that leap from evidence about some or maybe to a conclusion about all or definitely without very strong justification. That's the sweeping generalization trap again. Also, remember that if your conclusion is a value judgment about what should be, you generally need at least one premise that also contains a value judgment to support it logically. You typically can't derive an ought purely from an is. And lastly, a classic one, avoid circular reasoning. That's where one of your premises is essentially just saying the same thing as your conclusion, maybe using slightly different words. It feels like you're giving a reason, but you're actually just repeating the point.
Wow, okay. That's quite a journey we've taken there. We've gone from the big picture, what smart thinking is according to Allen, why it's seen as essential in our complex world, that really key social context, all the way down to the nitty-gritty. Claims as the basic building blocks, how they function as premises and conclusions depending on their role, and then exploring how they link together using that analytical structure format as a tool, understanding dependent versus independent premises, and even the special functions some premises can have, like framing or defining.
It really does underscore Allen's core message, doesn't it? That becoming a more effective thinker, a smarter thinker, and a clearer communicator isn't about some magical transformation. It's about gaining really explicit conscious awareness of these underlying reasoning processes. It's about acknowledging that crucial social dimension, getting into the habit of questioning your own assumptions and frameworks, and then using practical tools like that analytical structure to bring clarity and control to your own thinking.
Yeah, it feels quite empowering, actually. It provides a kind of framework, not just for passively taking in information, but for actively dissecting arguments you encounter, for building your own clear explanations, and for really understanding how ideas connect and how others connect them, sometimes, with very specific intentions.
Absolutely. And this maybe leads to a final thought for you, the listener, to ponder. Given Allen's strong emphasis that reasoning is always embedded in a social context, influenced by power dynamics, shaped by perspective, and that smart thinkers constantly question their own assumptions, Think about the last really persuasive argument or strong opinion you came across, maybe something you read, heard on the news, or discussed with someone. Try to identify its core claim or conclusion. What premises were actually offered explicitly to support it? And then, digging a bit deeper using the ideas we've touched on today, what unstated assumptions might that reasoning have been relying on? And whose perspective, whose context, whose interests might those hidden assumptions actually reflect?
That's a fascinating exercise, a great way to put these ideas into practice immediately. Definitely something to mull over as you continue on your own smart thinking journey. Thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive into the foundations of smart thinking.